All right. Hey, everybody. We're going to work through chapter 2 today. I'm going to go through and kind of really talk about the chapter definitions, and then we're going to get into a couple more points and then get into the readings that were assigned. So we're going to kind of do it gauged that way. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and let's get into this. I went ahead and did the iceberg because when we talk about any kind of equity or inequity, we talk about this idea of what we can see versus what we can't see, or hidden or vague or implicit or not illegal. And so we're going to talk about that overt kind of things. And this is a gender equity one that was built by Me Too, but really talking about how rape culture is built into this idea, and sexism is built into these ideas that are part of the iceberg that creates sexual assault and sexual harassment. And so this is kind of one of those images that I thought was important. And so I went ahead and that's how we're going to work through some of this. And at the bottom, we're really going to get at these idea of these terms and definitions that really gauge us and really start having the conversations that get up to the top of our iceberg. So again, another one of those pyramids or icebergs that we were talking about is this one of white supremacy over here. And I thought we would go ahead and start with our terms, and our terms are going to be all of our isms and obias. And by that, I mean anything that has like your sexism, your racism, anything that has an ism at the end, and or your homophobia, your transphobia, all of the things that have the obias at the end. And so that's really what we're going to talk about to start this. And then we're going to get into kind of how power is part of this and why power needs to be part of this conversation. So before we get into the isms and the obias, we have a few terms we need to talk about. First, this idea of the mythical norm, which is essentially that if you got all those hierarchical charts of every different identity, sexuality, class, ability, race, all of those things, this is the person that would create the ideal one. This is the one who would have the most privilege. Now, I'm sure there's things on here that, again, I can think of one right now that I didn't include citizen status or nationality on here, which I probably should have. But this is just this kind of core idea when we start to think about this mythical norm of everybody that we measure things up to. And this is the idea of what we would measure someone up to when we're talking about hierarchy. And it would be considered a white, male, middle class, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, able-minded, thin young adult. And so really just, and we'd probably also add full citizenship and the nationality of some kind of Western, European, or American ideology in there. In America, we would obviously consider that nationality to have to be American. Patriarchy is a societal structure which prioritizes, favors, and measures everything against notions of a particular kind of masculinity. These societies also track lineage through male lines. Colonialism is the political, physical, cultural, religious, or linguistic domination of one cultural group of people by another with the intention of stealing both the resources and the land by any means necessary. And this is again tied into historically, but it's also currently still happening. Privilege is the ability, opportunity, and lack of barriers to resources, both physical and social, resulting from a specific facet of your identity. This can be at odds with other facets of identity that leave a person oppressed, with the result of overriding said privilege or overriding certain oppressions. So for example, you might have a Black male person. That status of Black as a status of oppression might override the privileges that are garnered for being male in a specific situation, say police interaction. Whereas being white and maybe female, but being trans and able to pass might be given privilege in a situation where, say, I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head and I'm not having the best chance, but say like engaging in like at a queer bar or something. So that whiteness is typically going to garner them more access to certain spaces because they have historically, well, they haven't always historically been, but in certain areas, those spaces have been garnered to middle class white people and may give them more access. And so these different intersecting identities are going to create spaces where in certain situations, one identity might override another. And so you may have privilege in one, but not in another, or what have you. Hierarchy is a ranking system which prioritizes some. Those who are prioritized generally have more social power, control, opportunity, and accesses to resources. And then we're going to talk about some more terms. Inequality is the uneven, unfair distribution of opportunities and rewards that increase power, prestige, and wealth for individuals or groups. And then when we talk about systemic inequality, we mean that it's embedded within a system. So when you say this, we're talking about even without action, you can find inequality because it is written into the policies, ideas, social lessons, social grouping of individuals or structure that is particular to that system. So for example of this, when we talk about our legal system as being systemically racist, we're talking about the idea that that system was historically used, and there is still verbiage within it that creates a level of inequality for Black persons, because historically that has been used to was used to reinforce or reify slavery. And so using that judicial system in that way, there are still laws and practices that have written into them certain systemic ideas, whether being enacted on them or not. Whereas institutionalized is officially placed into a structured system or set of practices. So this is where you get into the engagement of those systemic ideas. So when we say that inequality is institutional, we mean that it has been made a part of political, cultural, linguistic, judicial, educational, or spiritual or religious practice. It means that grouping people in whatever said way is being acted out within an institution because it has been ingrained into the fabric of the actions by that group. And so this is really where you're going to see that the big core difference is that one doesn't necessarily need enactment to happen, and one is the enactment of something happening based on those systemic ideas. And then there's 5 phases. They talk about 5 phases of oppression within your textbook of exploitation, which is really this idea that your whatever it is that you have can be exploited, whether that's your labor, whether that's your resources, whether that's your positionality, whatever it is, it can be exploited. Then there's marginalization, or this ability to be set to the side or rendered at the margins of society, or rendered deviant or rendered obsolete. And then there's powerlessness, which is this idea that you cannot change your own, like at the way the system is structured, you are powerless in being able to change your own fates, your own social situation. And then there's cultural imperialism and violence. And so when you get through these steps, what you essentially get from is this point in which you are not being treated equally, all the way to the point in which you are rendered an object and something that can be destroyed. And there's a variation of this, and it goes back to that pyramid that you some of the icebergs and pyramids that are in imagery within these lecture slides. So getting into the isms and the obias, racism is the individual or systemic or institutionalized discrimination or oppression of specific groups based on their perceived or actual classification within the marginalized status of race. And then sexism is based on the status of sex or gender. Class is based on the same thing, but status of socioeconomic class. Ableism is based on the status of ability. Heterosexism is based on your status of sex within your sexuality. And ageism is based on that classification of age. Getting into the phobias definitions, xenophobia is the fear and or hatred, actualized or not. So this can be something you internalize or something that you externalize in anything from microaggressions to outright violence or taking someone else's life. And this is of any individual or group whose identity is or is perceived to be different from your own. And so xenophobia is just that fear of difference, fear of something that is different than you. Homophobia is anything or a fear that same kind of definition, but the fear of someone not being heterosexual. That transphobia is centered on this idea of that fear or hatred of someone who is transgender or a trans, under the trans umbrella, including non-binary or what have you. Islamophobia is a fear of anyone whose religion, race are or is perceived to be of any Islamic descent. And then anti-Semitism is perceived to be Jewish. Again, Nazism is a form of anti-Semitic action where individuals actualize their fear, hate, anger using political, social, and physical violence perceived by them to be a form of nationalism. It is not nationalism, it is hate. And so just to tie into that. And then fat phobia is this is linked to body shape and someone who is perceived to be or is not the mythical norm of thin. Some rules to remember when you're talking about definitions. A social hierarchy must be in place to have inequality. And so you can't have, because one group is socially prioritized, they cannot be reversed. So you can't have reversed sexism or reverse racism, because it requires you to be lower in a social hierarchy and not at the top of the social hierarchy in order to experience the inequality that results in oppression. So you can't be the socially prioritized group and then experience the thing that doesn't prioritize you, right? You can't be marginalized from something that prioritizes you. Inequalities build and or interact with other inequalities and privileges. So you can, again, have a privilege that overrides or interacts with another oppression or another privilege. Social hierarchies are not inherent, but are socially constructed. And arguably all social inequality is tied to our own economic structure of capitalism. And we'll get into that, I think, more so in one of the other chapters. All right, so moving back out of here, we're going to get into the study of power real quick, and then we will go and move towards, I will stop, and then we'll do all the other additional readings. But what does power have to do with it, right? So power is something that's like is something that can be acquired, it could be something that's shared, or it's something that someone can demand. But power is technically our cultural currency. It is the thing that allows you access resources. It allows you access to opportunity for resources. It allows you the opportunity to elicit control over others. It allows you the ability to not experience certain social sanctions or negative things. But when we talk about it, and we're going to talk about it when we talk about power in discourse, we're talking about discourse being defined as that process of creating knowledge or culturally constructing representation of reality. And so when we were talking about discourse, we were talking about this in connection to maybe that textbook assignment. So like that was a good example of talking about who has the power to create the knowledge and what knowledge do they get to create. And in doing so, we can talk about who gets reduced to a subject and who gets reduced to an object. And when we talk about that, we're talking about subjectivity and objectivity. And when we reduce someone or an entire group or an entire class of people to a subject or to an object, we allow for the erasure of them, the ability to be talked about as or talked for as opposed to the ability to speak for oneself about one's own life experiences, and or we can render violence to that existence, whether that be again by erasing them, whether that be by discrediting them, invalidating them, or whether that be by changing history to the form or discussing history from the point of someone who has done violence to them and that perspective only. And so really when we talk about this, we're talking about the process of othering someone. And when you're considered othered, you're othered outside of the norm, you're marginalized, you're considered on the margins, but in doing so, you are othered in a way that keeps you from being able to engage with the population as a whole, right? It others you to the point where you can be rendered obsolete, you can be rendered, have violence done to you. And as we talk about this, we're going to talk throughout the semester about how language is power and language as power. Whether it's the ability to speak in a way that is garnered acceptable, whether it is having the accent that is acceptable, whether it's using the verbs or the words or the what have you that is acceptable. Language can be structured as a form of social control, and it also can be structured as a way in which to elicit social sanctions. Derogatory language has been consistently used as a social sanction throughout all of human language. And so a reminder that the language that we use and the way we use it has connotations, and that will continue to be something that we talk about as we move forward through this class. Institutional power and the bootstrap myths. So again, this is tying that back to the capitalism that we were talking about earlier. This idea that of the American dream or the bootstrap myth, that as long as you work hard enough and have enough drive, you're going to get to where you're supposed to be. You're going to get to that American dream. You're going to get to that inherent amount of wealth that you're allotted. And the way that our social system works doesn't give people the opportunity or ability to overcome obstacles in a way that makes that actually accessible to most people. There is an inherent amount of opportunity that you need to have, social capital that you need to have, social networking that you need to have, social wealth that you need to have, that makes the bootstrap myth not accessible to a good large portion of the population, and thus gives power to those who do have the ability to access it, or continue to perpetuate that ideology that everyone has access to it. It gives them a certain level of power to be able to keep reinforcing that. And then just again, talking about the fact that oppression can be internalized as well, because we are all, no one is immune to social sanctions, no one's immune to social power, no one's immune to social propaganda, no one's immune to social learned behaviors. And so if you've been told your entire life that what it is that you identify as is wrong, there's a good portion or a good part of you that is likely to still feel that as well, or to feel that they have validity in saying what you are is wrong. And that comes down to, we are going to internalize and learn the social dynamics that we create, including the hierarchies, including the oppressions. And part of breaking those down is breaking down even how we feel about ourselves within those hierarchical structures. Again, power, social power also equals social power over resources, and that creates and garners opportunity and access. Institutions work to support and maintain power dynamics because that keeps the resources, access, and opportunities within their hands. It makes sense. That is inherent to the capitalist structure, is to keep getting more, is to keep doing more. And in order to keep gaining more, I have to keep making sure that everybody else has less. And so that's inherently part of the capitalist structure. And so I'm going to get off here now, and we're going to come back and do the individual readings, and they're going to be they're predominantly shorter, so we'll kind of talk through and touch base with some of those, and then we'll move on. I hope you have a great week and a great module. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you.